Okay, so today we're going to talk about architectural diagrams, and as they relate to Illustrator being one of the best programs to actually do diagramming. In order to have you do the diagramming in Illustrator, we have to talk about what diagramming is from an architectural perspective, so that you have some clue. This will not be the last time that you have to do diagramming. I promise you, when you move forward in your studios, 220, 221, you will constantly be asked for, give me a diagram of what's happening in your building. It's very, very common. It's something to get used to and to get very skilled at. The faster you can do it, the easier it is to really showcase your ideas. And you know, I was recently a reviewer for the 220 class. In their last review, their posters are still up on the wall in there. And one of the recurring themes of the review was about the diagrams, and were they too simple or were they too complex, and where were they, or that sort of thing. Most of the projects didn't quite have a good grasp of diagramming. So let's try to talk through that a little bit today, and we'll start with the question of what is a diagram. And basically, the easiest way of explaining a diagram from an architectural perspective is that it's designed to explain the main idea really, really fast. So if you glance at it, you suddenly have a full understanding of what this particular component of the building is about, right? So it's not meant to have a bunch of information. It's meant to be very concise and very specific, right? It's supposed to simplify your design into the major move, right? Or moves, depending on what it is. This is the view. This is the public space. This is the private space. It's something big, right? It's supposed to be very, very clear and easy to understand. It shouldn't be something that you have to stand up there and explain. It should be very obvious, right? And that's the purpose of it, right? When you're first learning to diagram, the best thing to do is to keep practicing at diagramming. And a lot of what happens in your sketchbook is, in fact, diagramming, right? When you get those initial sketches out and you're trying to explore various ideas, those tend to be very, very diagrammatic. In a lot of studio classes, instructors will ask you, well, show your process, right? And you'll end up scanning a bunch of pictures out of your sketchbook or something like that. That is essentially, show me all the diagrams that got you to where your final diagram is, right? Loosely translated. Right? If you're stuck in trying to figure out a diagram, you can try adding color. Usually color's a way that people suddenly, oh, I'm diagramming now, right? Because I've converted from drawing in black and white or in pencil into something that's in color. I'm going to color code it, or I'm going to draw some arrows or something like that. That's going to get you there, right? You can add cutout images or text. That can sometimes make it more abstract. I'll show you some examples later on in the lecture of that. And you can, of course, try a different medium, right? If you're primarily drawing pen, suddenly add some pencil. And this works with color too, if you switch to colored pencil or whatever. Depending on what you're comfortable with, right? Some of the things like pastels and watercolors, to me, unless you're doing them digitally, it's way too much work for a quick diagram, right? You need something a little bit faster to really get there. So here's some examples of sketchbooks that I did while I was in grad school. You notice that on this particular page, none of the drawings were actually drawn in the sketchbook. They were all drawn on trace or somewhere else, subsequently cut out and taped into place, which I think is a great way of doing it, because diagramming doesn't always happen when you have your sketchbook handy. Don't be afraid to draw on whatever it is that you're drawing on, and suddenly you can end up working through a system of diagrams. I don't even remember what any of those were about. I converted over into a different style of sketchbook while I was in grad school. This is a Moleskine that has a Japanese fold, so it's one continuous piece of paper. Which is a really fun way of sketching, because you can keep going from page to page to page. It's instead of flipping the page, it's just kind of one continuous stream of thoughts, which is kind of fun. And so you can see that we're diagramming how these various pieces come together as part of it. So let's look at some actual architectural diagram examples and talk about the techniques. So kind of the most famous diagrammatic technique was something called a Figureground, or Nolli's Plan of Rome is the best example of it. It's a strong graphic contrast to accentuate a strong physical contrast in the design, right? The normal is solid and void, public and private, big contrast, right? So we go to Noli's plan of Rome in 1748. I know this is a little bit blurry, so I took one piece and I blew it up for you so you could see it a little bit better. This includes the Piazza del Popolo. But what this is it's not a map of Rome, right? It's not a floor plan of Rome. What it is it's a diagram of Rome that explains what is public space and what is private space. Right? Now, of course, when we see it, we see all the streets and we see all the buildings, right? Just as we would if it was a plan or a satellite image or whatever. The difference here is that things like the interiors of churches, which are public space, right, are shown in white. The interiors of private space, houses, etc., are shown in black. So it's a very clear contrast of this is the space that I can actually inhabit or walk in or interact with as a public person, right? And everything that's black is stuff I don't have access to, right? So it's a very clear black and white, strong contrast. This style of diagramming is still used today, right? If you look at maps of museums, right, they love this, okay? This is where you have access, this is where you don't. It varies as to which is black and which is white, but the concept is still the same, right? You generally want to focus on the differences within your design framework, right? And you want to accent those differences with your diagram, right? It can be done in model as well as in drawing, okay? Sometimes you can add color, right, that helps this kind of color coding. So let's continue with some examples, okay? We have an old building. Sorry, this is a little washed out. We have an old building and we have a new building, right? The old building is all in yellow, so it's different. Right? Then we have the new building, and we have two different colors in the new building. We have the red and we have the blue. Okay? And so I don't know the difference off the top of my head. I don't even know what building this is, of what the red is versus what the blue is, but it's clear that there's a difference between the two because we use different colors. Right? So this is a Rem Koolhaas design. It's a library competition that they did. It's using the same kind of solid and void strategy. The model works just like the diagrams. So the model is in fact a diagram itself. This was an early study model of kind of how it was working, right? You can see kind of the crude quality of the study model, but it's still really showing the diagram of the voids and the places that you can inhabit. So let's look at it. In this case, these aren't plans, these are in section of the library. It's about these voids that happen within the greater context of all the density of the books that are in the library. So the things that are black are the books, right? The things that are white are the spaces that you can inhabit, the common areas, the places where you can sit and read. Okay? So they did a whole series of these, both in plan and in section, that identify each floor and show where you can inhabit and where you can't, because it's the stacks, that's where the books are held. Right? As we move forward, you can also choose to use flow lines, arrows, to accentuate moves, views, right? How people move through a space, those kinds of things. So I really like this example. I think it's very, very clean. This is a diagram of kind of a sectional perspective diagram of a staircase flowing into a theater. We don't even know where the theater is or what it looks like, right? But we see very simply with this fat red line, this is where all the people come. Right? So as the people come in, you notice that a little bit split off and they go down low, right? But the bulk of the people continue in and they move up the first set of stairs. Then it splits again, right? A lot of people come down level 2, even number of people come up to level 3, and then it splits and it continues up, right? So just by the thickness of the line, it doesn't even have any arrows on it, we're seeing how people inhabit and move through the space. That's a very clear architectural diagram. Right? This is another example that I absolutely love. This is a Japanese firm, Takaharo and Yui Tezuka. They do a ton of projects, and he has great, quick sketches that identify his designs. In this particular case, this is a house called the Floating Roof House that they did. It's on the side of a hill, and it's all about the fact that the roof floats above and the hillside flows through the house. Right? And so if you were looking at this diagram, you can very quickly get a sense of there's a strong roof, there's a strong hillside, and the hillside flows through. So now let's step that forward, right? right, into a kind of a more technical drawing. Right? This is a sectional perspective where you can see a little bit more detail. And then let's flip it all the way forward into what the actual building looked like. I apologize for the fold in the book, but here's the building, right? And basically the hillside flows through the bulk of the building. The walls and the roof extend out, right? I wish I had another good example. This is probably the best example. So there's the hillside. The center of the building is completely open and it flows out toward the view. So that diagram with the roof and the arrow is essentially showing us exactly what this building is about. This is the Sendai Mediatek by Toyo Ito. I can't read what any of the notes say, but I have a pretty strong sense, based on this drawing, that there is a bunch of floor plates that make up the building, and then there's a bunch of these spiraling voids that punch through the building. And those voids obviously do something. And in this case, I don't necessarily know what they do, but I know that they do something. Now, of course, I actually know what they do because I know what the building is. But my point is, when we're looking at the diagram and we're trying to analyze it, we can analyze it that way. Same building, the Sendai Mediatek. Very similar solid void analysis, right? The public spaces versus the private spaces, or in this case, the stacks of where the media is stored. And so you can see floor by floor what these diagrams represent. Then we get to more of a 3D model, right? We have basically the floor plates identified in yellow. We have the glass skin that goes on, right? And we have the tubes that punch through. So we have three primary elements that make up this building, right? And then we move into diagrams about how these really work from a structural standpoint, how they were created, how they were deformed, etc., how the floor framing works, additional examples, and then let's look at the actual built version. So there's our floor plates, and there's these spiraling pieces that go through. The spiraling pieces are the primary structure for the building, and they're also all of the circulation and the building mechanical systems. So the plumbing, the HVAC, all goes up through these spiraling pieces. So in this case, we can see this one's an elevator that goes up. This one is probably building mechanical, water and stuff. This is a set of stairs. We can see the door. The door's rather ugly, I'll admit. But we get into the set of stairs that go up, right? And we can also see that around these rings are pretty serious steel columns that are actually doing the primary support for this particular building. And there it is from the outside. So we can get a sense of the various floors, right? But also these spiraling pieces come up through the floors. Okay? Interesting side note, has nothing to do with architectural diagramming, but I like to tell this story because I think it's really interesting. So when Toyo Ito was designing and ultimately building this building, each of these cores that goes up through the building is clad in glass, right? And so on this particular core, which has the staircase that goes all the way up through, it's the fire safety stair. So if there was a fire on one of these floors, right, people would have to go down through that safety stair to get out of the building. So they had to make the glass that encloses that set of stairs a fire-resistant glass, right? And so they used a special glass. It's called an intumescent layered glass. It has a special gel on the inside that's resistant to heat. So you can actually walk through, right, the staircase with a fire raging and burning on the other side of the glass, and you can touch the glass and be fine because it's that resistive. It's a really cool technology. The other thing that you can choose to do with this particular technology is you can choose to have the glass turn opaque when it gets hot, or you can choose to leave it clear, right? Either way will work. In this case, they chose to make it opaque so that when you were running down, you didn't see the fire and panic, right? But it's just kind of an interesting take on what's available with a nice budget in the world of technology. So, sorry, side note, nothing to do with diagramming, but I think it's interesting. Okay? So we move way back in time to the Pantheon. Anybody been here? You have. What'd you think? It's a pretty impressive building. Okay? It's really hard to judge based on a drawing, but this diagram shows it really well in that a perfect sphere will fit inside this building. Right? It's exactly the same diameter in plan as it is in section, right? And so just to give you a sense, right, there's a person. This is a massive building. And so if you haven't been to Pantheon, St. Peter, something like that, we have a hard time understanding how big it is, right? We're used to, especially in California, we don't have particularly big buildings, right? We don't have buildings like this. So being in a space like this is pretty inspiring. If you go to Rome, do me a favor, go get a coffee and sit in the Pantheon for like 45 minutes. Just sit there because it's worth it. I promise you. Okay? So anyway, a couple photographs because I can't not show you a few photographs of it. That's what it looks like from the outside. Not exactly the most impressive building from the outside. However, inside it is extraordinarily impressive. So we look at the people, right? There's the people. Make note of the column and make note of this first band. And then let me flip back a couple slides, right? There's the people. There's the band that I was talking about. Look at how much more of the building is above that, right? So it's a lot bigger than you think. So let's continue on with some student diagrams, right? Showing how these things come together. In this particular example, it's more of a city planning, larger scale diagram, but I think it's still pretty relevant. It gives us a focus of what we're focused on in the interior here, and then it breaks up the horizon by regional, right, city, and then natural or ocean horizon, right? So it's breaking up the general view corridors, and then it's breaking up individual pieces within this particular context of the city. So it doesn't really matter what it is, what city it is, it's still a diagram of the city, and we get information about it, right? This is a diagram of site, similar using color coding to kind of explain certain regions of the particular site. It's a little bit complex to me. In this example, we've got a strong contrast. We've got the red and the blue, right? A lot like the solid and void. I don't know what they're representing by those, but at the same time, I understand that there's a strong contrast between one and the other, which is the purpose, right? So in terms of using colors to accentuate or draw out specific pieces of the design, this is a very good example of how colors can be used. So this, we have an axonometric, right, of various floors. It's probably a diagram showing public to private, right? The further up you go, the more private it becomes. Therefore, the colors change from the yellow to the red, right? So we're using those colors to identify what's happening in the building, right? Good example here. This was a studio project in Rome where we had the city and the density of the city, and then we had the Tiber River on the other side, right? We have the density in red. We have the, quote, nature, as much as it can be nature, shown in blue, and that this building somehow spans between those two realms. Right? Another example of a building, this had to do with certain view corridors. Right? They're identifying the viewing locations in red and the single line pointing out at whatever the view is. And I don't know the grander context, so I can't tell you what the view is, but we understand that that is definitely a view. Sometimes it's an understanding of how thermal systems work or some specific thing to the building. In this case, it had to do with heating and cooling systems. It's a little bit harder to see on the screen than it is in the actual slide. But basically, it had to do with operable windows at the lower level that were letting in cool air, operable windows at the top level that would let out the hot air, creating a stack cooling effect based on the height of the building, et cetera. And that's done by a simple gradient. Sometimes it's about two similar things with a switch. So in this case, what it looks like during the day and then what it looks like at night, right? And the fact that those change over time, right? Sometimes it's about identifying materials and making something read better, right? So up above here, we have a typical building elevation, just black and white. Down below, we have one with some color that's been added to it. It really identifies what the different components are in the particular building, right, just by those color codes. Anybody heard of cab spotting before? Good. It means it's a surprise. Anybody recognize this? This is all something you're very, very familiar with. Well, I would guess that you're familiar with. Bingo. San Francisco. Okay? So this is technically a diagram of the city of San Francisco. Right? So you can see Market Street. What do you think this is? Airport. Exactly. Right? A lot of traffic to the airport. So what they did, this was put on by the Exploratorium, is they took the GPS trackers in taxi cabs and cabs, and they charted where these cabs went over time. And as those cabs went various places, they developed a diagrammatic map of San Francisco. It's not an accurate map in the sense that it doesn't include absolutely everything or every street, because it's reliant upon where people traveled most frequently, but it shows us very clearly what are the most frequent routes, where do people tend to travel, and where do people move through the city in vehicles. Right? So it is, in a sense, a perfect example of a diagram of the city of San Francisco. Right? So using similar strategies, we could do a diagram of the flight patterns out of SFO. Right? We could do a diagram of where people move within SFO. Right? So these are some examples of drawings that I did related to my thesis. This is SFO prior to the Terminal 2 remodel. Terminal 2 is over here, right? But nobody really inhabited Terminal 2 at that time. And this is how people moved through the airport, right? So it took me sitting there with a pen dotting out where people moved, right, to draw this out. But it shows, right, a pretty good understanding of what's happening in the airport based on how people are moving, right? So it's a good example of a diagram. You can see it a little bit closer and where people are moving, etc. Right? This was another diagram for the thesis, had to do with interconnectivity of gates and whatever. Same kind of concept here, where you're abstracting these down. We might have something like a structural diagram, right, where we had where the columns were in a particular building and how they were supporting these various floating pads. This is a skin diagram of how the skin works as part of the building. Right? It might have something to do with a sketch about views. Right? How do you get access to this pool? Right? You have to walk through this, and therefore you have privacy because you're going around these various turns. It might be a site or a greater context, some kind of a creek or a river, and we have this site that goes across the creek and the river. Right? This was a fun diagram. We were asked about halfway through our thesis to diagram our thought process. And so this is what I thought my thesis was, and that's what it ended up being. Right? So it's a very clear diagram of what I felt like at that particular moment in time. Yeah? The gap was it was actually 2 cards. So this was the front half of the card, and that was the back half of the card. So additional examples. This is a combination of arrows and color. To me, it's a little bit overdone, but at the same time, it is still a pretty good diagram. I think it would be more successful if it was separated out into separate pieces and shown as a row. But basically, this is a theater setup, right? Talks about how people move, and then it separates out the civic, food, shopping area, right? I have no idea what the orange is. Public, outdoor cafe, right? And so we get this color coding, and we have an understanding of where the various spaces are and how they relate to one another, right? Another example here where we have some kind of an active space, right, and how that relates out to the context of the city as a whole. So again, clear, easy to understand. Right? This is a structural diagram of this tube and how the structure makes up that mesh. This one's a little hard to read, but it's an exploded axonometric that identifies various parts of a building and how they come together to make up the whole. This one's pretty fun because it's the same image over and over again with a variety of diagrams over the top of it. Okay? So we have this image, and it talks first about sun and how the sun hits various pieces. Then it talks about views with the arrows pointing outward. Then it talks about terraces based on the green places, right? Those are the little gardens. Then we move forward again, the same view. Where's the parking and the storage and that sort of thing, right? Where are the building's cores? Where's the commercial space? Where are the offices? Where's the housing? And where's the hotel and the restaurant? So you can see how all those come together as separate pieces, but they make a good picture of what's happening in the building as a whole, right? And so I guess in this case, these modules could change depending on what the current economic trends were. And so you can see really quickly how it would change based on those economic trends. Right? We have something like this, where we have a building, and then we have these what are called jewels that are inserted into it. right? They're identified by color in context with the greater surroundings. One of the things that I really like about this is that it includes so many people and how the people are interacting with the building. I think that's one thing that's very often left out, both in traditional plans and sections, but also in diagrams. Don't forget to include the people. Right? It might be a structural diagram that explains how the building is held up. Right? It can be both in model form and in drawing form. Right? It might be some combination of text and drawing. Right? So we have something like this. I think this is great because it's got a bunch of the people still in here. We've got some kind of a stage, and then we've got some kind of a viewing area, right? And we've got some kind of a superstructure that deals with the background of the stage, etc. Right? Sometimes they can be very bar graph-like, right? Less common in the world of architecture, more common in the world of city planning. Right? Sometimes they're abstract shapes that somehow get put together. I think this one is very well done, using words to identify certain spaces, right? So you understand at a quick glance what's happening in these various spaces because of the words that are identifying those spaces. So, I'm sorry, what? Yes. So in here, I don't emphasize where the diagrams come from because I want to talk about the concept of diagramming more than the buildings themselves. That's why I'm being vague about it. But yes, you're right. Good recognition. Example here, all right, about interconnectivity of spaces, right? Reunification, reurbanization, right? And so these red lines have to do with tying various pieces together. Sometimes it's this, then this, right? So what if we had this and we made it like this, right? So sometimes it's a two-part piece. Another example here of a building with a bunch of diagrams overlaid. I think that part of the reason this works is a lot like the one with the little cube modules, because we have the same view essentially with differences on it that explain what's happening in various environmental conditions. This one's kind of the over-the-top diagram. I think the sectional perspective is really nice, but I think the arrows are about as ugly as they can get, and especially the sun. So I think there would probably be a more tasteful way of doing this. It kind of destroys this really nice rendered model. But the point is still there. It has to do with identifying what's happening in the space. Right. Another example here of flow lines through a particular space. This is some kind of a city map of some kind. Right. I have no idea what this is, but I thought it was nice. Right. Take a city and identify its component pieces and then reorganize them by size. Right? So these are various neighborhoods and how they come together by size. It's kind of an interesting reorganization. This one's a pretty good example of kind of breaking the building apart. We have the central mass, and then we have the skin that covers it. And I apologize, for some reason the projector is really not doing a good job today. But this is that kind of skin that wraps the building, and then this is the center mass. Notice again that we have all the little people, right? People are fantastic for identifying space. Another good example of diagrams is this book called The Endless City, and it talks about changes in cities over time, and it compares a bunch of cities together. But this is a good example of color coding and really understanding what's happening in a particular city environment. Okay? Noli plan of Rome. Solid void, right? So you see this diagrammatic technique repeated over and over. Okay, so we're going to switch from there over into actually doing some diagrams. So bear with me for a second while we switch. Okay, so today you have exercise 119 to do. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you diagram either an existing building or one of your own designs. And so depending on what studio you're in or what you've been working on, I like to leave it open because sometimes people want to try to diagram their own work, which I think is as successful as diagramming someone else's. But it's still important to kind of think through whether you want to do another building or not. I'm going to ask you to do two things. One is to find a plan, and one is to find a section, because I think it's good to try to diagram both. So I'll go ahead and do an image search. So I'm going to do search Creative Commons image search, and I'm going to type in the Pantheon section. And I should have do a Google web search here. Okay, and so there's some that already have kind of the diagram. I'd prefer to have one that didn't have the diagram in it. So let's see here. We'll do this one. Actually, I like this one. Not big enough. Sorry, I'm trying to find one that's large enough. All right, we'll go with this one. So let me go ahead and view the image, and then I'm going to save this image to my flash drive. And today is 119. Now again, I would encourage you to pick your own image or plan or section. Okay, so we'll go ahead and save that. And then I'm going to go ahead and open Illustrator, and I'll do this twice. And I'm going to go to File, New. And I'll go ahead and say, OK. The size doesn't really matter. I'm still at the 1500 by 1500, which is what we did for the logo. I can use that again. And I'm going to go to File and then Place to place in that image of the Pantheon that's on my flash drive. There it is. We'll go ahead and use the free transform tool, which is right here, to make it a little bit bigger. Like that. Okay. So now that's here on my page. Now, when I'm doing the diagramming in the world of Illustrator, I want to pay attention to a couple things. One, I want to pay attention to my layers, because I want to be able to place the image on a layer and then lock that so that I can't select it or edit that particular layer. Right? That will also ultimately let me change the opacity of the layer so that it could be, say, a little bit lighter. Oops. Hold on a second. I have to select it first. I have to unlock it, select it, and then I can adjust the opacity here, right, to make it a little bit lighter or a little bit fainter so that my diagram shows up a little bit better. But anyway, for now, let's go ahead and go back to 100%. And I'll go back to my layer, and I'm going to lock that layer so I can't work on it. So a couple things that I want to do. First, maybe I want to identify the thickness of the walls in diagram form. Right? So maybe I'll take the pen tool. Let me Control+, and I'll zoom in. And I'll go ahead and start drawing. But notice that I can't draw because I locked that layer. So what am I going to do? I'm going to create a new layer that's on top and then start drawing on that layer. So I have layer 2 selected, and we'll go ahead and go to my pen tool, which of course I can't find anymore. I already have it selected. There it is. And we'll continue, and we'll draw right over the top of this shape. Click and hold to drag the tangent line there. All right, I'm going to switch this so it's outlined so that I can continue to see what I'm drawing. And I'm hurrying a bit because I don't want you to have to sit and watch me draw the whole thing. All right, and then we'll flip it back, and I have that nice black mass there that's representing one side of the building. Right, so I'll press Control minus. There it is, and I really need to do the opposite side of the building. So let me go back to the pen tool, Control plus, and we'll work our way down this side of the building. I'm going to flip again so that I'm just in outline mode. It just makes drawing a little bit easier. And if I were spending a little bit more time, I would actually work out the little arcs that are in this. And I'm just going to keep going straight down to there. Almost there, I promise. All right, so now I can flip that as well. And so now I've identified what those solid pieces of the building are. Right, something like that. Oh, I should probably do something along the floor here to represent the floor. The what? Yes. I could load up a hatch or a grunge or something that would do that, and I'll show you some examples of kind of how that might work later on. So for right now, I'm going to leave them as black so that we see that, and then I'm going to take my original layer here. I'll unlock it, and I want that because the building is not about this detail. That's not what I'm trying to show. I'm going to change the opacity of that layer to be way down. Right, I have to look at what it looks like on the projector more than anything else. So there it is. So really that part goes away in contrast to the big solid black masses. Okay, so then, right, we'll start to think about how would we diagram this particular building. Okay, one of the big things about this building is that it has a wide open oculus at the top, right, and the sun can actually pass through into the building. So one of the great things to diagram would be the fact that the sun is coming into this building. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work with the pen tool, right? And I'm going to draw, because the sun comes in straight, I'm going to draw a straight line. Oops, sorry, I have to be on the correct layer. And instead of doing it on layer 2, let's add one more layer, right? So we keep separating this out, right? And I'm going to draw, right, a line. And I'll start with a line, and we'll talk through what the various pieces of the line can do. So there it is as a line. And I want to look at the stroke. So let's open up the stroke, and let's change the stroke weight, right, so that it gets a little bit thicker. Right? In this case, maybe I want it to be, rather thick. So we'll go up at maybe 23 point. Right? And I can also look down here, right, and I have some options that are associated with stroke. And for this particular piece, it might not be relevant that I do a dashed line, but I'm going to show you some of those options as we go forward. Okay, so first option here is that I can choose to make my shape or my line dashed. And so I can check the box for dashed line. And it's going to make a dash right now of 12 points. My line is very thick, so it looks more like little rectangles. If I wanted it to be, let's see, if I went up to 23, right, there would be little dots. Right? If I doubled the 23 to 46, right, I'd have longer dashes. right? I can also control the gap. So I could say 46, 23, right? I could say 100, and then 23. And you can see that I can customize what this line looks like in the various dashes, right? So we'll go back to where it was just 46 and 23 as a kind of a consistent piece. As I come down here further, I have the ability to add an arrowhead on the start and on the end. So in this case, I want it to be on the end, and I can choose to put an arrow, right? I can come down here. I have various styles of arrows, right? I have one that looks more like a standard arrow, right? At the ends, you see that I can put like an end on the arrow, something like that. But to me, that's a little bit overkill. But you get the idea, right? So generally, I stick with something like this one. I think it's pretty good. And I'm going to uncheck dashed line so it's just a solid line in there. Okay. Now the other thing is we experimented a little bit before with the width tool, which is right here. This may be a good place for the width tool. So I'm going to make the back end of this a little bit fatter, right? Something like that. And I'll make the front end a little bit thinner. Something like that, right? And so now I have a tapering arrow that's coming down through the building. Okay? I don't really want it to be the black color because I think it's a little bit strong. So if I come up to either my swatches or my colors, right, I want it to change to be more of a yellow fill color, something like that, right, so that it's identifying the fact that this would be sunlight. Right? This is probably a little bit too bright yellow. Right? Maybe I'll switch it a little bit more into the darker orangey yellow. Right? Something like that. Okay? And so this, at its most simple stage, is a diagram. It's a very simple diagram, right? That represents the fact that sun can come through. Right? Now maybe I wanted to do a diagram, and this is one of the advantages of the layers. Maybe I wanted to do a diagram where I wanted to show that rain can fall through this particular hole. So maybe I'll go back to the pen tool, right? And let me make sure I'm on this layer. Good. And I'll draw a line. Oops. Sorry. I'll draw a line that goes straight down, right, through that hole. And let me go ahead and copy it, and I'll paste it, right? And I'll have another line that's next to it. Okay? So in this case, the line is yellow. I don't want it to be yellow anymore. Right? I'll be a little bit corny and pick blue. Right? Something like this. And we'll go ahead and up the size a bit so that you can see it. And actually, we'll just delete that for right now. Now, in this instance, right, the rain, maybe I don't want it to be completely straight. So I could spend some time and I could draw an arcing arrow. And let me change so that it doesn't have a fill color. Right? I could draw something like this. On either one of these, right, once again, I can add an arrow at the bottom. Sorry, thank you. I can add an arrow at the bottom. Right? But maybe I want to take a little bit, I want to change this a little bit so it's not just a solid line. And I can do that by using something called a brush. And so we haven't covered brushes yet, but there's a little, looks like a desk cup with some stuff stuck in it. That's the icon for brushes. And there's a variety of brushes that I can use. These top brushes tend to be like a chisel point or a calligraphy type brush, right? Where, let's see if I can make one a little bit bigger. Hold on. Right, where instead of having it be a big thick line all the way through, right? It's as if I was drawing it with a vertical chisel point, and I drew it, right? I can do it as if it were, a round line. Oops, sorry, I have to select it. I can do it as if it were a round line, right? I can do it, in this case, it's a chisel brush that's not as turned. This one tends to look pretty nice. It looks like a little bit of a spiraling ribbon, so it tends to be pretty good. When I apply the brush, however, right, a lot of times it makes the arrow go away. So you see I no longer have the arrow, okay, even though it says that the arrow is there because I have the brush applied. So I'm going to need to use the pen tool and draw an arrow at the bottom of my line. Something like that. And I tend to go back to the brush tool and pick the same brush when I draw the arrow. And then I don't remember what, it was 9 point. Let's take this and make it 9 point. And maybe that's a little too much for that end. Right, you'll have to sort out what the right weight is, right, for the end of that arrow, and do a little bit of moving to make sure that it looks right. Okay? So the point is that you'll actually have to draw the end of the arrow and decide what looks right as part of it. Okay? These are not by any means the brushes that you're limited to. If you click on the little triangle with the 4 lines next to it, we can go to Open Brush Library, and you can see that there are arrows, there are artistic brushes, etc. For right now, I'm going to open up the artistic brushes, and we'll use the chalk, charcoal, and pencil, right? Or the ink, or notice there is watercolor as well. We'll start with the chalk, charcoal, and pencil. Right? Now, when I pick that, right, let me go ahead and copy this so we have a couple more versions of it. I know this is going through the building, but I'm just trying to illustrate the points. When I pick one of these other brushes, right, we're going to get a slightly different take on this particular line. And so in that case, it's not all that exciting, right? We'll go through, but you can see that it has a little bit of a rough edge to it, as if I were drawing it by hand, right? As we look at this list, right, we can get to where they're even more of a hand-drawn look, right? Almost an ink look. So you really have a lot of flexibility in what these look like. These also tend to taper at either end, right? Which can be nice for how the arrow ultimately looks. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the arrow on these lines so that they're not competing. And we'll draw our own arrow at the end. We get back to my brushes. And so you can choose any one of these lines, right? And of course, you can also edit the color of the line to be whatever color you wanted. If you wanted it to be a little bit darker, you can make it a little bit darker. Okay. Now, that's the chalk, charcoal, and pencil lines. I told you there were other lines that were available out here. So if we go to Open Brush Library, we can open watercolor, we can open ink, or paintbrush. There's a huge flexibility in terms of what these look like. I will encourage you to select your own and play around with what looks right to you. You can see that the paintbrush is far more transparent as it goes over, right? But that might be a good look. It might not be a good look. It's really a matter of you determining what's the right look for you. Okay. The other thing that we can do is we can make some transformations of these lines. So if I select the line, I can go to transform. It's not there. Hold on a second. It's under Effect, and sorry, I don't do this very often. Where is it? All right, I'll have to go back and find where. Distort and transform. Right, I could go to zigzag, for example. And this will show me, if I click on preview, it'll break my line into zigzag points. Right? I can also choose to make it smooth. Right? Now, if I zoom out, I'm going to have to hit cancel for a second. Let me Control 0 so you can see this. So I drew this line, right? But if I wanted it to be a little bit more even, right, I can go up to that Effect, Distort and Transform, Zigzag, right? And from here I can control, based on these sliders, right, that I want a smooth curve. Let me go ahead and preview it so we can see it there. So I'm getting a nice smooth set of curves rather than me drawing it, right? I can control, right, how many I get, right? How smooth I want it to be. I can increase the size or I can decrease the size, right? Being on how far they're far apart. I can also do it where they're zigzag, right? So I have a lot of flexibility to transform that curve without having to draw it manually myself, right? Which is the point of showing you that. So it's a nice smooth curve. This line I can still apply a brush to, right? So the brushes apply on top of that zigzag transformation. Okay? So we have a lot of flexibility in terms of how those end up coming into being. Okay? Once I have, however, the brush applied, the width tool won't work anymore. Right? Oh, it did work. It used to not work. My mistake. So I can still control the width of that particular brush. Hopefully I can control it on these other ones as well. Double check. No, it doesn't seem to like it on this one. Yeah, it doesn't like it on the calligraphy brush. So it may just be on an art brush. Okay? So let me go ahead and I'm going to browse for a plan view, and we'll do some examples of the plan view. Okay? So let me go ahead and go back here, and let's continue in the world of the Pantheon. And let's do a Pantheon plan. Perfect. And I'm going to go ahead and save the image. Save it there. Perfect. And I'm going to create a new Illustrator file to work on this. Go ahead and say OK. And I'll go to File and then Place. And we'll place the plan in there as well. Okay? So I would spend a little bit more time, obviously, redrawing and identifying where the solid pieces are, etc. But for right now, I want to concentrate on showing how people might move through this space. Right? Now, in the Pantheon, if we look at it carefully, it has one primary entrance right here, and then you would circulate around, and then you come back out the primary entrance. So if I were diagramming how somebody might move, right, I would use the pen tool, and again, I'm going to do it on its own layer. And I would draw, okay, somebody's going to come in from outside, like this. And they're going to come around the space. And they're going to exit something like that. Okay? Again, I don't want there to be a fill, so we'll go back to where there wasn't a fill, right? And just like I did before, right, we can come over to my brushes, for example. I could apply a brush on this particular path. And let's go ahead and, I don't like that brush. Let's go to the chisel so you can see it a little bit better. Right? And then maybe I'll add an arrow on the end. And I need the stroke to be a little bit more on those. All right, anyway, so we have this path that goes through this particular shape, and it would work fine from a diagrammatic standpoint. Maybe I'd change it, I'd select it, and I'd make it, red in color or something like that to make it stand out a little bit more. And then maybe I'd take the first layer here and change the opacity again so that my diagram was standing out. Okay? So certainly this is one way of doing the diagram, and there's nothing wrong with this diagram, but sometimes you want it to have a little bit more specificity to it. And so instead of doing it that way, I'm going to do something that would mimic somebody walking this path. Okay? So I'm going to, on its own layer, right, I'm going to zoom in here. It doesn't really matter where I draw this. It could be anywhere. I can lock that so I can't accidentally select it. And I'm going to draw, right, a pair of shoes, right, or boot prints, something like that. Let me switch. Hold on, I have to make my stroke thinner so that. Hold on a second. Unhappy with it. Try it one more time. All right. Say something like that. And let me go ahead and fill these in. And we'll make them black. Okay, and then I really should convert that upper toes are rarely that pointy. Let's smooth it off a little bit. Okay, so I have something that looks like that. I'm going to go ahead and copy it and then paste it. So Control-C and then Control-V. But I want it to be the opposite because now they look exactly the same. Feet are usually opposite each other. So let me go to Transform. I can just right-click on it and go to Transform. We'll reflect. We're going to reflect it vertically. So I'll say OK. Now it's going the opposite direction. Okay. We'll put those together just a little bit. Right, something like that. And in reality, we probably should kick it out just a bit. Because feet tend to go out just a little bit. Okay, so I'm setting those up as two different steps. Okay, something like that. And given the size of this building, those steps are a little bit large. So before I make this into a brush, I'm going to go ahead and transform the whole thing to be smaller. So let's go ahead. I'll hold down Shift, and we'll make those steps more realistic in size. Right? They're probably still even a little bit smaller. Something like that. Okay? Now that I've done that, I'm going to open the brushes window up here, and I'm going to drag this object. So I'll select it with the black arrow, the direct select, and I'm going to drag it to my brushes. And when I drag it to my brushes, right, it's going to pop up, do I want to create a new brush? Right? And so I want to create what's called a scatter brush. And I'll go ahead and say, OK, by the way, there's a tutorial for how to do this on the website. If you go to tutorials and you go to Illustrator, it'll say scatter brushes 3.8, and this will go through exactly what I'm doing and how the process works. Okay? So we'll call this footprints. Okay? So we've got some options here. Size can be fixed or random. My feet aren't going to change size, so we'll leave them as fixed. Right? The spacing can be fixed or random. In reality, right, the steps might vary a little bit, but we'll leave it as fixed because it should be fairly consistent. Right? The scatter will stay as fixed. And the rotation, we're going to say, we'll leave it as fixed. And our rotation should be relative to the path. Right? So we'll set it as that. Our colorization, right? I forget which option we want to pick. I think we want to do tints. Right? We can go back and we can edit this after the fact. So then I'll go ahead and say OK. And I get my little brush that shows up here. So now what I need is I need my path. So we'll take this path. And instead of having that calligraphy brush applied to it, I'm going to click on my little footprints. Right? And so when I click on the little footprints, you see that my path changes to the footprints. Right? The problem is that the footprints are going in the wrong direction. Right? If we were looking at it, right? My feet aren't in the right direction. So we'll have to go back and we'll have to edit this. Right? And we'll go to rotation, which is fixed. We'll go to 90, right? Which should adjust my rotation. Right? Apply to strokes so that the feet are going in the correct direction. So now where I used to have, right, an arrow that was walking through the space, I now have a bunch of little footprints. Okay? Now, I can take these footprints and I can increase their size by increasing or decreasing the point size of my line. Right? So let's say we like it at like maybe 1.5 points. There it is. Right? And so now instead of, let me go ahead and delete this anchor point. There. So that it's just straight. Instead of having an arrow on one end, the line that I drew, the path that I drew, has on it, right, a directionality because the feet are going in one direction versus the other. Okay? So now let's say I wanted to continue and I wanted to just add some density. Okay? So I have more people that are coming in this way. And maybe this person decided to look in here and then come out. And then they decided to go out and look across the center. And then they went back out the door. But they went off in this direction. Right? I can take that curve, and once again, I can apply the feet to it. Right? We'll do it at the stroke of 1.5. Or maybe we'll leave it at 1. Maybe this one should be at 1 as well. Right? And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue adding density to this diagram of where people are walking in this particular space. So I'll keep going. Right? I can go to my brushes. I can pre-select it. And then we'll keep going with more and more people. Maybe somebody walks in this way. Right? And so that one needs to have this applied as well. And then we keep going. And we keep drawing the paths as we go through here. And you can see that over time, right, you get a density that represents one of those like cab spotting type diagrams where you're charting movement through a particular space, right? And all it is it's a bunch of footprints that keep showing where people are going, right? So you can see that's relatively easily. You know, if you wanted to do it with dog footprints, you could do that. I mean, you get the idea of what that scatter brush can do in terms of what you're trying to create. You could also, if you didn't like this, or with footprints, right, using the same strategy, we could draw something like a little arrow. Go ahead and fill that. Right, something like that. Same strategy here. I'll take this arrow and I'll drag it over into my brushes. I'm going to create a new scatter brush. Right, fix, that's all fine. Rotation is going to be at 90. Right, and I'll go ahead and say OK. And now instead, right, I could select these lines and I could apply that arrow and I'd get a bunch of arrows. It looks like my, sorry, this should be at 0. Right, well, maybe it's at 30 or something. Did I say relative to path? Sorry. Right? And so instead of the footprints, I now have a bunch of arrows that lead through the particular space. It's really up to you in terms of what you create, but I think it's important that you understand this is the strategy for creating it. Right? If you wanted a bunch of little dots, that would be fine as well. Okay? Just in terms of teaching you a few of the other things that you could do, right, with this, is let's say you were charting, let me jump back to my section here. Let me turn off this layer. Let's say you were talking about how birds flew through the space or something, right? I could draw a new line here. Something like that. And then I could spend a little bit of time and actually draw a bird. right, so let's say here. Sorry, I have to make this. It's so thick right now we can't see it. We're going for the stylized bird look right now. Right, something like this. Let's fill it. So that's now my bird. I'll drag that to the brushes. Right, I'm going to do a scatter brush. Right, and this time I'm going to change this. So instead of having the scatter be fixed so it's even, right, we'll make it random. And when I do that, I can choose the percentage. Right, so how much randomness is allowed to happen. Right, the spacing I can also choose to be random. Right, so they won't be consistent together. And my rotation will go random, but it's relative to the path. And I'll go ahead and say OK. Now let's take this path and apply that to it. And you can see that the birds, right, are not consistently on the path. Right, they're scattered. And so I can keep changing these values to see what looks right. Right. So let's change the spacing to be much more random, and let's change the scatter not to be. Right. The rotation we're going to stay fixed, and I'll go ahead and say OK. And we can see that the spacing is much further apart, so probably too far apart. So now we come back and we say that the spacing needs to be closer together. Say OK, and apply to strokes. And we can see that the birds are now over the top of themselves. Right? They probably need to be rotated relative to the path. So we'll try at 90 and see what happens. Right? And so here we've got the bird flying in and going back out. You get the idea. Okay? And the point is, be creative about what you're trying to diagram and what you're trying to show. And Illustrator really has a lot of these tools that are built in for it. Okay? I told you also that you, based on your question, Henry, that you wanted to talk about how do I modify these solid black walls to have something behind them, right? I can choose to apply a particular swatch to this. So we previously talked about loading swatches that have a pattern, or that like the Prismacolor markers, right? If I do a Google search for Illustrator swatch patterns, right, I should be able to find some examples. I'm picking images. Some examples that have various patterns associated with them. I'll be able to load that swatch and then drop it in. I'd have to spend a little bit. I don't have one off the top of my. See if I can find one. I have to figure out where. Okay, well, I can't seem to figure out where to download. But the point, oh, there it is, download. Amazing how they hide stuff, right? Okay, so it should be in my downloads folder. Let's see if we can load it up. And again, I'm doing this live. I don't know. I don't have confirmation that this will work. Let's see. What was it called? All. Perfect. All right, so let me jump back into Illustrator. It's in this monochrome. There it is. Let me go ahead and open it. So there's a whole bunch of hatch patterns, right? And so I would take my object and I would then pick one of the patch patterns, right, that they were using. As an example, depending on what you were trying to create. You get the idea. Okay. So the other thing that we can do is we can apply a grungy texture to this so that it's not quite so stark. And we'll cover this one in about 4 or 5 class days anyway. But for those of you that are advanced and following along and want it, I'll show it to you now as well. Just like in the world of Photoshop, in the world of Illustrator, we have blending modes. And so if we come over here into transparency, we have the ability to apply blending modes and to apply layer masks as well. And so what I want is I want to first find the grunge texture and place it into my image. So let me go ahead and go to File and then Place. And I need a grunge texture. I don't know that I have one already here. Of course I don't. So I'll have to find the grunge texture. Actually, you know what? I'll save this for later on, and that way I'm not overloading you. Most of you are clicking away anyway, which probably means you're off into your world anyway. Okay, so today I want two... I want two diagrams. I want a plan diagram and I want a section diagram. You can choose what it is that you're actually diagramming, right? So I did examples of people moving through space. I did examples of light. I did examples of rain. Whatever it is that's relevant to you. View would be a good example. Pantheon is not about view, right? Maybe it's about the view up out the oculus or something like that, so you could do it that way. The building you choose is up to you. It can be a building that you do, or it can be a building that someone else has done. Also, the plan and the section don't have to be the same building. They can be 2 different buildings, depending on what you find. Trying to think if there's anything else. No, I don't think so. Are there any questions? No? Once again, to reiterate, everything that I did with the brushes is also available here under the Illustrator tutorials. So brushes will walk you through how to work with brushes. Scatter brushes is what I was talking about with the footprints, right? Background texture is what I was about to show you, but we'll get into that a little bit later on in the course of the class. Okay? Good.